Thanks, Arthur. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all a little bit about the work that I'm involved in, and appreciate your guys' enthusiasm on this topic. And before we get started here, I'll have the maybe Arthur, you the host, if you would please disable. It says host disable the participant screen sharing. So if you can allow me to screen share, then I'll be able to pull up my presentation. But I'm a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe here on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. We share this reservation with the Northern Arapaho. So there's two sovereign entities. I did get my undergraduate and graduate degrees from Montana State University in land resources and environmental science. And so, we say go Cats. I currently work as a tribal buffalo coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation's Tribal Partnerships Program. I also sit on the board of directors of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which is a membership of 69 tribes involved in bison restoration or buffalo restoration. I say bison and buffalo interchangeably because bison is obviously the scientific name, but buffalo is more often how we refer to them in our tribal communities. Of course, with over 574 federally recognized tribes and over 330 distinct languages in the indigenous people that are on this continent, in this country, we all have our own names for the animal. Like in Shoshone language, it's Quitsu or Bojan. In Arapaho, it's Hanacha. Oftentimes you hear the Lakota term Tatanka, dances with wolves, and some of those. So, I encourage you to understand, some of the importance of some of those languages and bringing them back. So buffalo is a very near and dear to my heart. But so is water, and water is another issue that Arthur and I have spoke about the issue with water. But the water in buffalo is really what drives my interest in this. And if we had an idea of what states may have looked like if they were dictated by the tribes, in that first part of this GIF, you see the colorful distribution of territories. And that's probably what those right there would have looked like. But with over 800 treaties made with the federal government, 400 of them ratified by Congress, every single treaty was violated or broken in some way. And so then, the jurisdiction and sovereignty and these things are continually chipped away at. Even today, we're still fighting to hold on for parts of our land base. And so that it becomes a contentious issue in these land cession dealings and how we mitigate some of those issues today. The story of and history of buffalo and Native American people very similar in that we're now on remnants of our once former vast territories, Native American tribes on reservations, and buffalo essentially in parks and refuges and private ranches. And buffalo was for many tribes, especially those tribes in red, those reservations in red, were buffalo people. The buffalo was, along with the other wildlife species, the economy. The economy for millennia here was based on the biodiversity of wildlife that existed. And buffalo was essential and critical to that. It was food, clothing, shelter, but it was also the foundation of our spirituality, especially the Plains tribes who practice the Sundance ceremony and the sweat lodge. That buffalo is integral, ingrained, if you will, in those ceremonies, and are very important in our cultural revitalization efforts today. As westward expansion continued through the Oregon Trail and the California Mormon trails. They converged through the Shoshone territory at South Pass, just south of the Wind River Mountain Range, which is adjacent to and included in our reservation. After these trails and the federal government congressionally encouraging the wholesale slaughter of buffalo or bison, that resource and the tribes fighting for that resources became more contentious. And it really was the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where George Armstrong Custer was killed by the Oglala Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, that it became congressionally encouraged to eliminate buffalo. And oftentimes it was only the hides and the tongues that were taken. The hides really allowed for the growth of the Industrial Revolution. The hides made belts that drove the machinery. But they say that the prairie in the middle of summer looked like winter because of all of the bones that littered the prairie. And so they went out by wagons and gathered these bones up and put them on trains and shipped them east, where they were made into fertilizer and fine china. Personally, a lot of what drives this work for me was an opportunity I had to take a trip to East Africa with my dad, where we witnessed the wildebeest migration in the Serengeti and the Masai Mara. And it was like driving 100 miles, and in every direction, as far as you could see, the entire length was wildebeest. And we counted about 30 other species in amongst these animals, like impalas and gazelles and zebras. And one day we counted 88 hyenas, but leopards and lions. This was less than 5% of what the buffalo was here less than 200 years ago. And so that really, it really hit home for me to witness the sheer number of wildebeest, but to really be able to compare that to what 30 to 60 million buffalo look like, as opposed to 1.5 million wildebeest. When the buffalo was essentially eliminated from the landscape, when Lewis and Clark came west, they witnessed 30 to 60 million buffalo. By 1902, there were 23 left in Yellowstone, a few in Canada, but less than 1,000 on the entire continent. When reservations were established and tribes were forced onto those reservations and buffalo were eliminated, it made way for these large beef operations to come in. Settlers and explorers and even the federal government encouraged livestock and agriculture to move in. But cattle were susceptible to freezing temperatures in the climate and often froze to death. So in an effort to make a stronger cow, they forcibly, either through artificial insemination or what have you, introduced cattle genes into the bison genome. And so in the early mid-1800s, Charles Goodnight and Charles Jones created a cattle, but that resulted in infertile males, and they were difficult to handle. So phenotypically, you can see the cattle genetics in these hybrids. In 1965, beefalo were created with the opposite sex ratio, and there's actually a World Beefalo Association today, but the cattle genetics is a big problem in the bison genome. So in the United States today, there's between 850,000 to 950,000 buffalo in the United States. 90% of these animals have cattle gene integration, and they're under commercial meat production, or they're genetically manipulated for like docility handling. The area that we primarily work in is the conservation herds of buffalo, and so that's the sliver in red and yellow. And the Department of Interior manages 12 conservation populations that are genetically reputable. They've been rigorously tested for disease. They can be certified as disease-free animals. And because the federal government is managing these animals, it makes the trust responsibility fulfillment a little easier. So we're not so concerned about the 850,000 or so buffalo in the commercial meat market. We're focused on ensuring that these conservation buffalo, that we can establish satellite populations of those animals to ensure the genetic heterogeneity and health of those populations. Because even though there's 12 conservation populations and there's a few other populations on tribal lands and such, none of those populations meet the population threshold needed to maintain that heterogeneity. So the IUCN, or International Union Conservation of Nature, has red listed buffalo as a species of concern, primarily because none of these conservation populations reach that 1,000 animal threshold. So there's still a lot of work to be done in ensuring that the bison genome is protected, and more of those animals are established. There's a lot of tribes involved in this effort, not only the tribes of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, but other tribes that maybe are not member tribes of ITBC. Because of the recognition and understanding that these animals are the remnant population, they haven't been messed with by man. As we know, the more man gets involved, the more things get a little screwed up. And so, leaving these animals to be as the one above intended is a holistic approach to managing these animals. And some tribes can do that easier than others because of the reduction in our land bases. Some tribes only have a couple thousand acres to manage buffalo. Some tribes have a little bit more. But nonetheless, getting these animals back to our communities is part of not only our own healing, but also healing the land as a species. The buffalo itself is a source of life. Everything from the animal was utilized for sustenance, from the internal organs like the stomachs and the bladder, to the sinew and the backbone, the bones that are carved for various tools, the hooves, which would have been melted down to make glue, the ribs, utilized to build sleds and things for wintertime, and a buffalo robe itself, one of the most highly prized, would allow you to survive in negative 20, negative 30-degree temperature weather. It would take 14 to 16 hides to make one teepee or one lodge. And so if you had a community of 20 teepees, that's over 320 buffalo just in the lodges alone. So this animal was our store. It was our Walmart. I talk to kids a lot and ask them, where do you go when you need stuff? And they all yell out Walmart. This was our Walmart, and everything that animal was utilized. Buffalo have very unique behaviors like wallowing. This dust bathing behavior is unique to buffalo, but it creates ephemeral pools on the landscape that are important for water accumulation, and buffalo themselves very important in seed distribution. A lot of the cultural plants like foods and tools and medicines are associated with wallows. And because buffalo have a unique grazing patterns also, they're primarily graminoid feeders, which allows the forb species to grow, which is why you have increase in plant biodiversity with buffalo as opposed to cattle. A lot of these plants that they leave to grow, the forbs, are those cultural plants, the foods and the tools and the medicines. And a lot of my thesis research itself was titled Cultural Plant Biodiversity in Relic Wallows, because the area that we had anticipated restoring buffalo to had some baseline data for what the plant species were, and in anticipating that once buffalo are restored, we would be able to cross-compare some of that data to show eventually that the biodiversity of our plant species in high elevation desert increases in a similar way that it does in tall grass prairie ecosystems. As a keystone species, they benefit not only the four-legged ones like prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets and badgers. They also are very beneficial for certain bird species like the ferruginous owl and the mountain plover. These three species listed as species of concern by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And as we restore buffalo, these species come back. And actually, the cowbird is a misnomer. It should be called the buffalo bird. Um, but after buffalo were eliminated, this little bird had nothing else to sit on but cows. A lot of birds need buffalo hair for their eggs to reach the right incubation temperature in their nests. One day I was out at our buffalo and saw an osprey, and it looked like it was carrying a snake as it flew overhead, but it was actually carrying a big strand of buffalo hair. And so, cattle don't shed their hair like buffalo do in the springtime and the summertime. When there were millions of buffalo, there would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of hair available to these animals to use. And so the removal again of that animal has been a detriment to many species, but also lepidopterans, butterflies, the blue carny butterfly, arthropods, many species of insects, but even reptiles and salamanders in areas in tall grass prairie. A lot of these species are cultural species. We have relationships, we have ties to these animals. If you've ever been to a social celebration like a powwow, and I would encourage you to, if you haven't, once COVID restrictions and things are lifted and celebrations like that can continue, our dancers, the chicken dancers, the traditional dancers, they are modeling those dances off of these birds. And so our cultural ties run very deep and are millennia old. A lot of partnership and collaboration have been happening, for instance, with these maps that recognize our place names for Wyoming and the place names for our reservation. So this is an example of a partnership between the tribes and the University of Wyoming to help educate the public about what we called this place and our places of importance prior to settlerhood. And so, I'd encourage you again to look at where you are and the indigenous people that are there and what are they doing in terms of cultural revitalization, food sovereignty, and exercision of some of these treaty rights or agreements that allow for restoration. If you've been to the Wind River Reservation or you've been to Wyoming, it's an interesting place to visit. I'd encourage you all, if you have an opportunity to come here. The topography ranges from 4,000 feet in elevation up to 13,000 feet. And so we have a summer and winter habitat available for all of our other wildlife species that we've been able to manage here. We are part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and actually a lot of the lands around us, like the national forest, the wilderness areas, and the national parks, were previously Shoshone reservation. But today, contemporarily, oftentimes our tribes are left out of that conversation just because our exterior boundaries of our reservation were reduced. Doesn't diminish the historical and cultural ties that we have to these lands and these places. In terms of conservation, the tribes have a long history here. In 1938, the tribes here established the very first wilderness roadless area. This happened 26 years before the Federal Wilderness Act. This set aside 180,000 acres that contains over 200 lakes and several hundred miles of rivers and streams. Anybody can come here and purchase a fishing permit and hike into the wilderness area to fish. A very important piece of protection that happened in the 30s that is still incredibly beneficial to not only our people here, but our wildlife, especially the elk and deer that utilize that area for summer range. In 1984, the tribes established a game code. Prior to this, year-round hunting was allowable, uh, but the result of was the extirpation of pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep, and this was highly controversial at the time because the federal agency was telling the tribes that they could no longer hunt year-round for sustenance, which had been done for millennia. But with the reduction in the land base, tribes, um, it was apparent that unregulated hunting resulted in a diminishment of those populations. With the implementation of this, what was predicted would happen did, and that was that if you put seasons and bag limits on the wildlife, you allow for reintroductions of those extirpated species, that those populations would grow to a level where tribal members would have access to those animals for sustenance in a way that we never really have. And that is true today. Uh, the only one really missing still is the buffalo managed as wildlife. In the 1990s and 2000s, the tribes passed comprehensive wolf and grizzly bear management plans that recognizes these animals as kin, that as relations, that we have stories where we learned from the wolves and bears how to be good human beings. And so we don't eat these animals, we don't hunt these animals because of the cultural relationship that our grandmas and grandpas instilled in us, that these animals have a place here, that they shouldn't be eliminated because of livestock or cows or depredation to sheep, that these animals have a rightful place on this earth and on our reservation and in Wyoming and other places. So over the years, wildlife management here has likely been more successful than a lot of other reservations in that we manage not only the predators, but 6 of the 7 ungulate species that were here prior to Lewis and Clark. And so the only one left really prior to 2016 was the buffalo. And so there's still a lot of steps that we need to take to get to where we want to be in terms of managing these animals on the landscape as wildlife. But we're taking steps to get there. Just to give you an idea of what that game code did for our populations of ungulates, specifically elk and deer and pronghorn. Prior to the game code, you can see in red that our populations were fairly small. And these numbers in green are from 2013. So we can estimate that there's at least 2,000 to 3,000 more of those animal species than there was then. And so successful wildlife management has made it possible for our tribal members to access our traditional foods in a way that not a lot of tribes get to. The conservation of buffalo and the restoration effort couldn't have been possible without our partnership with the National Wildlife Federation. So I worked closely prior to being hired as the tribal buffalo coordinator to work on behalf of the Shoshone tribe to acquire buffalo and hold the federal government accountable for that trust responsibility and really being a facilitator of the buffalo and getting them home. So in 2016, we brought 10 buffalo from the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge in Iowa. In 2017, we brought 10 more from the National Bison Range in Montana. And then we formed a tribe-to-tribe agreement with Fort Peck to share in the Yellowstone offspring. And so we brought 5 bulls from Fort Peck in 2018. And so we've grown our population to 34 and really looking to expand the range and habitat available to buffalo and really help to set precedent for what wild buffalo management can be on tribal lands. And so that partnership has been really successful. There's also a lot of other tribes and other conservation NGOs and in the public that want to support this effort. And so we've convened meetings prior to COVID for really how do we do this successfully and make it a win-win for everybody. And so there's a lot of strategizing and partnerships and collaboration and now Zoom meetings and a lot of momentum building behind buffalo restoration, not only the tribal lands, but also in the public lands. And so in Montana, a tribally managed herd is being proposed for the Charles M. Russell. I'm working closely with Wyoming to potentially establish a population in public lands in the Red Desert, which is the largest unfenced area in the U.S. at 180 miles wide and 90 miles north to south. Another incredible place to visit if you're in Wyoming. But really, the most important aspect of this work is for the children, for our up and coming generations that need to have a foundational understanding of buffalo and the history of buffalo and Native people, not only for our own Native youth, but for non-Native youth. This is an American story that isn't taught in schools. It's not taught in our systems, educational systems. We have to dig deep to find this information about how that buffalo was life's commissary. Why is it so important as a keystone species on the landscape today? What types of ecological integrity can we restore by bringing this animal back? I've been called idealistic for this, and even in government officials have asked me, you mean you want to go back to living in teepees and hunting buffalo off horseback? Well, hell no. But we can restore and we can reconnect with this animal that was critical to our survival, our grandmas and grandpas who relied on this animal for life's commissary. It's very important that we have this as a food source again. This animal is the most healthy meat. It has the most protein, the lower in cholesterol. It's higher in minerals than almost any other meat. And when this animal is removed from our diet, it's resulted in the highest rates of heart disease and diabetes than any other ethnic group in the U.S. So this is about food sovereignty. Restoring this animal to our communities as a food source is incredibly important. Also educating our youth about how and who we are as Shoshone or Crow or Lakota or Cheyenne or any of those buffalo tribes that relied on this animal historically. It's not only the federal government's obligation to help us do that through trust responsibility, it's also the self-determination of the tribes to pursue those endeavors to improve the health of our people. And so as our young people are educated and they are growing up with buffalo, they're going to have a lot more optimistic future knowing that we have these animals available to us again, not only as food, but for our ceremonial ways, for the revival and the return to our prayer and spirituality that was nearly stamped out from us and from our communities. These future generations will be our next leaders. Unfortunately, they will have the tools in place that I didn't have to ensure that we have these animals and we have our language and our ceremonial ways intact is really how we move forward into the future. We had to start small. We started on 300 acres, and this is currently where our 300 buffalo are. 34 buffalo are. But the intent is really to take a piecemeal approach so we can grow the understanding and grow the community support for this buffalo program. Because there's hundreds of thousands of acres on this reservation where we've done wildlife reintroductions before. But for some reason, we're in this paradigm in buffalo restoration where people think that you have to bring them in, you have to fence them, ear tag them and vaccinate them and treat them like cows. And that is the farthest thing that we want in terms of this buffalo. We want them to exist on the landscape. like the elk and the deer and the moose and the bighorn sheep and the pronghorn antelope and the mule deer and the white-tailed deer. These animals need to be able to move freely, but by taking a piecemeal approach, we grow the community support to ensure that everyone has ownership in this program. So our reservation we share with the Northern Arapaho. In 2019, we helped facilitate the arrival of 10 buffalo from the National Bison Range for the Arapaho tribe. So currently the Arapaho tribe has 10 buffalo in the area in blue. The hope is that we can grow this program so that it's under the auspices of both tribes, not one tribe benefiting and having buffalo over the other tribe, that Shoshone and Arapaho people are both Buffalo Nation people. And as we manage these animals as wildlife, that makes them no different than the other wildlife species we have. And so then growing that ownership allows everybody in the community to buy into this so that they can exist not only in this area in yellow, but really expand to the mountains of the Wind Rivers, where there's 400 to 500,000 acres, and an additional 700,000 acres in the northern boundary of the reservation. And so as we understand that potential to move forward with buffalo, we really have to have a leadership that's sound in our history, in our federal Indian law and policies, what that trust responsibility means, the eras of federal Indian law and policy that have led up to our contemporary issues. If you look at these eras of policy, they've been detrimental to our land base, our language, our culture, our ceremonies, our customs. But now we're in an era past self-determination, in a time when we can exercise sovereignty, exercise and fulfill that self-determination. And federal Indian law is really what helps us to do that. And through self-determination, we're able to implement a lot of programs, but we have to have the right leadership in there to do that. We have to ensure that the federal government is upholding its obligations to our nations because of those treaties, because of those agreements. When we diminished our land bases, it was supposed to be in return for that trust responsibility, and the federal government has failed that, and this administration is no exception. Quite worse, actually. And so the sovereignty of the tribes is continually under threat, not only by the federal government, but also state government. And so a lot of people don't understand what sovereignty and self-determination and federal trust responsibility is. But all of the 574 federally recognized tribes have this as a means to move forward in healing our communities. Buffalo is at the heart of that. Water is also at the heart of that. And so we really have to do our due diligence in our tribal communities to educate folks about a lot of these issues that we have, but really the foundation of where we are in terms of making decisions for our communities. And that's extremely difficult with all of the atrocities of the past. We carry intergenerational trauma. We have high school dropout rates and the highest suicide rates amongst our young people. There are a lot of social challenges that we have to get through in our own healing to really implement a lot of our sovereignty and where we need to go in the future. And so with that, I'm sure many of you have some questions or thoughts or comments, and so I'll go ahead and open it up to that, Arthur, if that's okay. if there's anything that else you want me to touch on, I'd be happy to do that. Or
Oh, thank you, Jason, so much. If we were in the room together, you'd be hearing a very boisterous applause because I know people appreciate everything that you've said. I will sort of turn to Albert, who's the official host here, and see how Albert wants to sort of moderate Q&A.
Either way, I think we can ask questions, or if folks would like to ask some question in the chat, we can also do that.
and I've got my chat box open here too, so I should be able to see if people are asking that way if they didn't want to show their face.
Well, why don't we go for the hand raising function? Of course, people could also write questions into the chat, but hand raising will catch our attention. Either way, hand raising or chat. This is the part, Jason, where a lot of our students wonder who's going to go first, and hopefully one of them will do so. But Justin Bashairs has raised his hand. Justin,
yes,
come on in.
Well, thanks, and thank you, Jason, so much for the talk and for sharing the history and perspectives. It's a fantastic kickoff for our seminar. And I just wanted to ask, Arthur shared with us the Wind River documentary, which I'm not sure if is that your dad? Is Richard?
Yeah, it is.
So that was, really tough, powerful, painful, and tough to watch, and really highlighted the role, of course, as you know, of the water rights and water issues and the view of the state of Wyoming that, if you're not using it for ag, you lose it. And I'm just wondering what that was, maybe, I don't know if that was 15 years ago or so. Is that still just as current and problematic as you think about restoring buffalo ecology and think about restoring your sort of traditional ecosystems?
Yeah, unfortunately, that film is as relevant today as it was then. The Wind River is still depleted every year, especially during the late season months, and it's primarily irrigating alfalfa and sugar beets. So at the same time, the Wind River is essentially dry, where you cross it, not get your feet wet. You can go to the wastewater ditches that are coming off of the non-engineered fields, and they're running it over 500 cubic feet per second. Ironically, an amount of water that the tribe wanted as in-stream flow to maintain the fishery. So the Wind River is still depleted in the same way that it was during that film. And, I think that something eventually will come to light. Either the tribes will have the right leadership to move forward with pressing that issue, or we establish a nonprofit autonomous from the tribes that really holds those water users accountable. It comes down to excuse me, the prior appropriation doctrine, Western water law that really encourages the inefficient use of water to divert main stem river systems for irrigated agriculture is unsustainable. The Wind River itself, 35 to 45% of the flows of the river are from glacial melt. The Wind River Mountains contain the highest concentration of glaciers in the lower 48. And research being conducted by Central Wyoming College and University of Wyoming estimate that it's going to be gone in 50 years. So we've already had the longest running court case in the history of Wyoming with this Bighorn case. Imagine what that battle is going to be like when there's 45% less flows of the Wind River. Do you think Wyoming is going to prioritize fish over agriculture? I doubt it. And so really we have to be diligent again as with our legal team but also our leadership to emphasize that cultural indigenous knowledge that tells us that water is life. Water here is scarce, and that for us, that water, we call it our first medicine. And to one of my grandmas, she said that one of the worst things that came with the white man was the toilet, because to defecate in clean water is the most disrespectful thing that you can do to clean water, especially in a place like Wyoming, where water is scarce. We're in a high elevation desert. And so how we treat water is really about how we treat ourselves. And that fish is an extremely important food source for our people, historically and contemporarily. But in those lower stretches of the Wind River, we can't fish that anymore. And agriculture has been a detriment because of the pesticides and the insecticides and the herbicides that drain into those systems and cause eutrophication that's disrupted the ecological integrity of those fisheries in many instances. And so it's a big challenge ahead of us. And again, it's about educating our youth about these issues, about this history, so that we can adequately have the right tools in our toolbox when the time comes to fight these things. So I've got a question from Julia. Was wondering if you talk a little bit more about the co-management aspects of buffalo conservation. This partnership between the National Wildlife Federation and the Shoshone Tribe really began with an MOU, a memorandum of understanding that recognizes the sovereignty, the government of the Shoshone Tribe, but it really aligns the Shoshone Tribe and the National Wildlife Federation in conservation. So the Shoshone Tribe recognizes that these buffalo should be genetically pure, that these should be Yellowstone genetics. They have to have disease-free certification to eliminate any of the argument that we would have bringing those animals in. And the most important aspect is really that ultimately we manage these animals as wildlife. And so those criteria overlap for the tribe and for the National Wildlife Federation. What's been a real help in this effort is that through National Wildlife Federation, we bring the funding to cover the costs for the tribe. For instance, we initially had to fence off 300 acres. Because it's on a limited land base, we have to provide winter feed. So we cover those costs, as well as the salary for an individual to check on the buffalo every day. So we've raised all of the money through our nonprofit to ensure that this program would be a success on behalf of the tribe. Eventually, when they're managed as wildlife, there's very little cost associated with that. And once they've kind of crossed the threshold of that distinction from livestock or to that of wildlife, then that federal trust responsibility again kicks in, because the Fish and Wildlife Service, as a federal agency, makes management recommendations to the tribes in managing our fish and wildlife resources. And so the National Wildlife Federation is footing the bill, so to speak, until we can get that designation. And then those recommendations by the Fish and Wildlife Service fall into place as we manage them as a wildlife species. And so that's been successful. I think the biggest challenge is probably that paradigm in teaching our people that we don't have to treat them like cows. People have forgotten to see these animals on the landscape as wildlife, and instead you see them, in parks and refuges and private ranches, and thinks that's the only place they can exist. And that's essentially behind fences. And so we have to get out of that paradigm to educate our people and the public and others that this species has a legitimate right to exist on the landscape as those other animals do. Wildlife management is a lot less about managing the wildlife as it is about managing the people. Because if we took those buffalo from their habitat in Yellowstone and we put them on their habitat that we have here in Wind River, I guarantee you, they're going to do just fine. It's the people that we have to manage. And so that's where that educational component comes in. The successes, I think, really are getting hooves on the ground. Bringing in buffalo for the Shoshone tribe, bringing in some animals for the Arapaho tribe. The next steps are really to create the language and insert the language into that game code. The one that we implemented in '84 didn't contain buffalo language, and so we have to insert that language in there through our tribal council governments. And so that will be a success. When we can allocate that 67,000 acres that was in the area in yellow on that map, that will be a success. And I think in this effort, we take small steps and we take small successes with those challenges, and we just keep building on those successes and keep getting to where we're headed. 5 years ago, I could have never imagined where we are now. So in the next 5 years, my hope is that I'll be saying the same thing. Tracy says, what can you learn?
So Jason, I'm
Yeah.
going to interrupt here and just recognize that the official time for seminar is up. However, we have invited folks, and we should include the folks with lingering questions here in the chat to stick with us afterwards. And so maybe before everybody who needs to go signs off, let's just all sort of think our collective gratitude towards Jason for this really wonderful experience of hearing him talk. So thank you so much, Jason, and goodbye to those who need to sign off. And let's just take 1 minute to let people shuffle out, Jason, and then we can go to those next questions. Does that sound good, Albert?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason. This was great.
Thank you, guys. Arthur, grab a cup of coffee. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Arthur, could you share the URL for the movie that you mentioned, the Wind River documentary?
Yes, I will. I will do that, Mary.
Thank you.
Yeah. Although, Mary, I'll say don't watch it close to bedtime because I tossed and turned for quite a while.
Thanks for the warning.
It's disturbing. And anybody else who's here who would like me to share that, please just shoot me an email. I went through quite some technological machinations to get it downloaded, and it's a particular way I need to share it. But feel free to reach out. This is a film about the conflicts over water rights and water use on the Wind River Reservation. It's about 30 minutes long. It was made in the late 90s and is really fascinating and affecting as well. All right, Jason, did you get your coffee?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Well, Jason, what we now have is a smaller group that encompasses many of our wildlife and freshwater faculty and students, and so folks who are working on a wide range of wildlife, population ecology or community ecology. Similar questions in freshwater, although also encompassing hydrology on the freshwater side and issues about water flow and use. And we've also got a number of other folks who just stuck with us, even if they don't work on wildlife. So why don't we just go back to those lingering questions in case those folks are still with us, and then they can head out and we can sort of engage whoever's left after that. So it looked like you've got so many thank yous, it's hard to track. Okay, so Tracy Burnett had asked, what can we learn from buffalo that we can't learn from people?
Well,
Especially know if learning from buffalo enables a less egocentric type of learning than people. I would imagine so, but maybe you can elaborate for us.
sure. A lot of our familial behavior in our tribal communities, especially the Buffalo tribes, were modeled after buffalo, um, but also how I mentioned grizzly bears and wolves. So the wolf pack, uh, people witnessed and emulated those styles of living, learned to hunt from wolves. Bears have showed us many medicines that they usually eat after they wake up from hibernation. We have roots that we use in our ceremony that we call bear root. So we learned a great deal from animals, and similarly from buffalo. Our communities used to be matriarchal, and with colonization and assimilation, and the schools that were run by Catholic and Christian missionaries, that structure has changed to patriarchy. But in our traditional societies, the women held the highest status amongst our tribes. The women, the eldest women, were the ones who made the final decisions on many things, and that's similar to buffalo. Buffalo are matriarchal, and they are led by a lead cow. There's been some interesting experiences by just spending time with buffalo that you come to learn and understand. And there's a virtual tour that we put together that I'll send you the link for, Arthur, a YouTube video.
Okay.
Just spend some time with the buffalo. But one time with buffalo, a friend of mine was out, and he tells this story. His name's Fred DeBray. He's from the Cheyenne River Reservation, and he had was one of the first directors for the Intertribal Buffalo Council. But he relayed some experiences to me that were kind of impactful. And one was that he was out with the buffalo, and he had a little wolf pup. One of his dogs was a hybrid wolf, and he was out visiting the buffalo, and this little dog jumped out and was running around chasing the buffalo and causing disruption. And what he witnessed was that about 10 bulls, elder bulls from that herd, came out of the herd and surrounded that wolf pup, made a circle around him, and that wolf pup cowered and hunkered down on the ground. And he said he witnessed those buffalo bulls all start to breathe at the same time. And he said it was a very mystical type of an experience that just kind of put this little dog in his place. And after a few minutes, the buffalo dissipated, and that wolf ran and jumped back in the truck. And so that was an experience. Another one that I witnessed was we had a buffalo die, and ironically, instead of our buffalo giving disease to livestock, we actually have to worry about disease from livestock. Malignant catarrhal fever is fatal to buffalo, and it's airborne. It can float up to 5 miles, and there's no vaccination for it. But goats and sheep carry MCF, and livestock producers are not required to test or vaccinate for those types of diseases. And so one of our buffalo died from MCF, and so we were there and monitoring this buffalo dying. And as she died, we didn't really know at the time what was wrong with her until we were able to perform a necropsy. But when she died, all of the other buffalo came into line and put their noses on that buffalo. And it was like they each one went and said goodbye to this buffalo that died. And it was interesting because I was with a colleague there, and it's the same thing that we do when one of our own dies. When we have a traditional burial for one of our family members, we do that. And I think a lot of our human behavior is emulated from not only that buffalo, but in a way that we don't even really acknowledge. And buffalo are communal. They are a tribe. They are concerned about the welfare of each of their individuals, and that's how our tribes were. That's been eroded with colonization and assimilation and those policies and things. But I think that speaks to that ego, that it's not about the individual. It's not about me or I. It's about we, and it's about our, and it's about collectivity. And I think we as human beings, we've forgotten how to be human beings. And we see that, and you turn on the news. We don't have a relationship with our food. We don't have a relationship with that water. We don't have a relationship with the land that we walk on. And that's all ego driven. And so as we get back to more communal ways of knowing and thinking, a holistic approach, we call it the medicine wheel approach, that's how we used to be. And there's a lot of elements in that we need to bring back, not just for ourselves as tribes, but for humanity. It's not, we're all human beings. We're all here together. But we compartmentalize and we divide, and you're right. Ego is what drives us today.
Well, thank you, Jason. So our friend who joined us from outside of our department, Paul Klingenstein, asks a question. As you consider your expansion plan for buffalo restoration, will that draw on collectively held lands, public lands, private lands, all of the above?
Well, today almost all buffalo exist in parks and refuges and private ranches. The buffalo restoration work on tribal lands is just that. It's buffalo restoration on tribes, reservation lands. And no better place really than here at Wind River, where we have hundreds of thousands of acres of potential habitat that are already habitat for our other 6 ungulate species, prime habitat, winter and summer range for buffalo. Now, our reservation is very unique in that most of our reservation is tribal land. The majority of it is. Many tribal lands have been fractionated by the General Allotment Act that creates a checkerboard effect within those exterior boundaries. If and when we can restore buffalo and manage them as wildlife on this reservation, that will really set precedent for what wild buffalo restoration and management can be on tribal lands. That conversation, though, is shifting to include public lands, and especially lands out west that are primarily public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We can encourage our public, you and I, all of us, that land management agency to prioritize ecological integrity instead of what's been prioritized, and that's livestock and grazing and oil and gas development. And being that these are public lands in the West, we have an incredible opportunity for restoration, and that conversation is happening a lot faster than I could have anticipated. And so, the Charles M. Russell is 1.1 million acres in Montana. we are proposing a tribally managed herd on those public lands in Montana. Conversation is happening here in Wyoming for restoring buffalo to the Red Desert, the largest unfenced area in the nation, 180 miles wide and 90 miles north to south. Incredible potential for buffalo restoration. There's many others. In the Midwest, almost all of the rural counties are declining in population, and there was the Poppers from the 80s, a husband and wife duo that were proposing the Buffalo Commons. That because these counties are declining in population, why not remove some of these fences and put buffalo back? That didn't go over well in the 80s, but that conversation is kind of gaining steam again. The Lame Bull Treaty in Montana was set up as a Buffalo Commons. The Lame Bull Treaty had language in it that said that there would be a collective herd of buffalo for tribes to have access to. That was eliminated. And so in that language for the Charles M. Russell, that falls within that territory of the Lame Bull Treaty. And so a tribally managed herd on public lands there makes sense because of that federal obligation, which was undermined, but can be upheld. And so, you know, again, Paul, we're not necessarily focused on the 850,000 buffalo that are privately managed that have levels of cattle gene integration. We're focused on that conservation population that is less than 25,000 animals, and ensuring that those genetically pure animals are establishing satellite populations where we can grow that population threshold up to 1,000 animals.
So Jason, thank you for that. I myself have several questions, but I'm going to hold on those and see, hopefully, if a few of our students might want to speak up. And I think at this point, it'd be okay to just unmute yourself and ask a question. And if we have any trouble with that, then we'll try hand raising. But any of our graduate students hankering to ask Jason a question now? Oh, and I see Mary Power has raised her hand. Mary, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk, Jason, and for your amazing work. I am interested in the comment you made about buffalo selecting grasses in more specialized fashion, leaving the forbs. And I wonder how you'd expect the prairie to change if you realize your dream and get bigger herds that move with more natural densities and more natural migratory rhythms. What would that do to the prairie vegetation?
Well, we know that in other places like American Prairie Reserve and even at Lake Fort Peck, where buffalo are ranging on several thousand acres, 20,000 acres, and measuring the ecological changes that we've theorized are coming to fruition. And that is that plant and animal and insect and bird biodiversity all go up. A buffalo primarily feed on the grasses, and that allows the species to grow, and that's where you get the plant biodiversity. But buffalo have also the ability to control their metabolism in the wintertime, where they can slow the metabolism. They can survive on less hardy forage than a cow can. A buffalo, of course, also has 7 times the hair per square inch than a cow. So that's why you don't have buffalo freezing to death in the winters. They actually face into the storm and will walk through the storm to get to the other side, as opposed to cowering in a corner of a fence. They also have twice the surface area on their teeth as a cow, again allowing them to digest different species more so than cattle. So we've seen it and have documented it. The birds, those 3 that I mentioned that are species of tern, the ferruginous hawk, and the mountain plover and the burrowing owl have come back. Other bird species that were unanticipated. The overall diversity just it blooms and blossoms. And I really wish I had some photos. I'll have to do that, where I can show some photos of a before and after, because it is quite drastic.
Thank you.
Any other hand raises? Oh, Ted, I see you doing a raising of your real
Yeah,
hand. The old-fashioned hand.
the old-fashioned way. Yeah, Jason, thank you so much for the talk. I was really interested
And maybe,
in
you know what I should have said? Sorry, Ted. I should have said
Yeah.
a smaller group, maybe just quickly introduce, folks could introduce, who you are and what you work on.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm a freshwater scientist, one of the faculty members in the department, and I was really interested in hearing about this buffalo behavior that you described, where they were creating these depressions in the ground that create these seasonal wetland habitats, and just generally the ecological role of the buffalo. And I guess my question is, I'm curious how your sort of vision and strategy for restoring the buffalo, and your vision and strategies for restoring the Wind River and the in-stream flows that support healthy fish populations sort of intersect, and what is sort of the dialogue between in your thinking around those two, like, really critical elements of tribal sovereignty and of sort of restoring the ecological integrity of this system.
They're really inseparable, and I'll give you an example from a spirituality aspect. In our ceremonies in the sweat lodge, it's a purification lodge, and so it's seen as when you go in there, it's like a renewal, a rebirth, and that water is considered. We call it our first medicine. It goes back millennia, to the very, very old days. That water was our first medicine. So in our languages, we have a lot of sayings about how water is sacred, water is life. And in our Shoshone language, we say Bah Nanashunte. In Arapaho, you say Hinati Nech. And in Lakota, they say Miniwachoni. All of our tribes have a saying very similar to that, because we all recognize that water is life. Every living thing relies upon water. And of course, that's backed up by science. It says, ourselves, we're made up of water. In that sweat lodge, we take in these old rocks, and we call these rocks our grandfathers, because they carry a lot of the wisdom. They were here with the dinosaurs, and they'll be here long after we're gone. And when we heat those rocks up with that sacred element of fire, that fire that provided heat and ability to cook our food, those elements are in every ceremony that we have: water, fire, and that purification lodge. When you combine that sacred water of life with those hot rocks in that sacred structure, we call that the breath of God, that steam that is creating the heat. So in all of our ceremonies, it's about sacrifice. It's about sacrificing yourself to receive something good from that great mystery, that unknown force out there that many call God, many call Creator. Whatever it is, it's a great mystery that provides life and sustenance for us. Our sweat lodge is modeled after that buffalo. The same amount of trees are in the structure of that lodge that are in the rib cage of a buffalo. There's 28. And so that lodge itself is representative of the buffalo. And when you're in that purification lodge, and when you put that lodge together, the last pole that goes in is representative of the tail. And in front of the lodge sits a buffalo skull. And it's that connection that with that water and that buffalo and that purification lodge that teaches us our relationship to all of these things, all life, all of our relatives. We say, Besihi, Nate the Ena, all of our relatives. And that's not talking about our moms and dads and brothers and sisters. It's the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the birds, the ones that crawl above and below the ground. Those are all of our relations. And when we're in that lodge and we're close to the Mother Earth, and all of those elements in there, and we're sacrificing ourselves in that heat, that is about where we get true power. True power is in that great mystery. And so these things are all inseparable. And in Western science, we compartmentalize things and we take things apart and we try to figure them out. And really what Native people knew was the interconnectedness of things, that everything that we do to one thing has an effect on another. And so as we take care of the water, it's going to take care of us. If we take care of that buffalo, it's going to take care of us. We have to have that type of a holistic philosophy in all that we do for balance. And so that, you know, in our ceremonies, those types of things are foundational and they're inseparable, and we cannot continue to compartmentalize these things. There's a book called Native Science written by Gregory Kahete, and a lot talks a lot about the metaphysics and the interconnectedness of things, and really the philosophy behind Native ways of knowing. And would definitely recommend that book as a source to kind of draw some of this philosophy from, and you know, it's foundational for our communities, and really ensuring that those types of opportunities and learning are there for our young ones is really how we're going to build this from the bottom up. And I found my own healing in that. You know, I was talking to Arthur today about my own struggles with all of these things that have been instilled upon us. And, you know, I struggled for years with alcohol, but now I have, you know, 2 years of sobriety. But I found that healing in Buffalo. I found that healing by going back to my ceremonies, by asking for the help that I needed to get through my troubles and my problems, and that's been that Buffalo again in my healing, and that water, and through ceremony, and understanding that you know, I've always talked about how this healing, the buffalo are important for healing. I could have never anticipated that it was healing also, or in as much so for myself.
Jason,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest that folks raise a hand if they have a question, but since I don't see any, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one of my own. And it's kind of picking up on a few things you said, including the tension and perhaps, you know, conflict between Western science and Native science. And you mentioned, you know, earlier to me that you live off the grid and have a, you know, different way of living than many of the rest of us. But you went to graduate school. You went to Montana State. You sort of entered this other, you spent many years there, and here we are with a bunch of graduate students and people who are thinking about the real challenges that we have right now about making institutions, including universities, more inclusive, and so I read this. I was really interested in and moved by this article about your work in the MSU magazine, and I don't know if MSU made the claim or you sort of made the statement in that article that was actually a very that was a positive environment for you, or you found community there. Would you mind, since you're speaking here to so many graduate students and faculty who are thinking about these kinds of challenges, just talking about what, if that's true, what I was reading in that article about the community that you found there, sort of what contributed to that sense of inclusion or your positive experiences, or if that wasn't true, maybe you can tell us a little bit about why.
Yeah, when I decided to pursue my education seriously, I asked for some advice from some of our elders, and they said it's good that you want to go for an education, but first be grounded in who you are. Know your songs, your ceremonies, your language, so that you know who you are when you go to the university, because what you'll find is that that university will try to turn you into something you're not. They'll try to encourage you to go a direction you don't want to go. And so I struggled with where to go. I started at Black Hills State University. Didn't really like that. So I went to Colorado State University. Didn't really like that. Ended up getting an associate's at a community college in Colorado. I avoided the University of Wyoming, largely because I didn't want to wear a cowboy as an emblem. Wyoming is like cowboys and Indians, and usually the Indians lose. And so I didn't want to carry the philosophy of a cowboy. That's actually contrary to who I am. And so when I visited with folks at Montana State University and was encouraged to take a visit, I visited the university and found that there was a large Native American population, largely because there's 14 tribes and 7 reservations in Montana. And so the community there felt more like home, in that many students were not, many students, Native students had families, was in a similar situation as I was. And so I did find a lot of community there. Another important thing that I found was that I knew when I went to MSU, I was going to focus entirely on buffalo, with some issues over water. But buffalo was really what was driving me. And as an undergraduate, I wrote a draft management plan for what buffalo restoration could look like. I did an internship with USGS and worked with the BISON specialist, and was able to get an EPA STAR fellowship to fund my graduate work. But really, I found faculty there who supported me in what I wanted to do, as opposed to throwing a project on me that maybe I wasn't interested in. I was able to work entirely on what I wanted, and was driven enough to find the resources to make it happen. And so, through those funding and fellowship opportunities, I was able to accomplish what I wanted there at MSU, and still have lifelong friends that I met while undergraduate and graduate school. Then that's why I did both my undergraduate and graduate degrees in the same department, is because I had the momentum and the backing really to continue with the work that I started as an undergrad, which maybe a lot of students don't have. You go to undergraduate at one university or institution, and then transfer to another one, and complement your learning. Mine was a little bit different in that I was really striving for buffalo restoration to my own reservation, and that's morphed into working with many other tribes on buffalo restoration.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to allow for an awkward. Oh no, Amy. Amy is jumping in. Go ahead, Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I'm a graduate student in the wildlife group here in Justin's lab, studying how species interactions are affected by fences and boundaries. But I had a question for you about, I'm curious what your opinion is on, so this enormous buffalo restoration effort is like a multi-pronged approach. And what, in your opinion, are some of the largest or the largest roadblocks to getting it moving forward? Is it this mindset of this ego or approach? Is it misinformation and rhetoric around disease and interactions with cattle? Or does it have to do with tackling laws and changing the laws? Or is it about getting land? Like, where do you think the roadblock is to really move this forward.
You just said them all of those things are huge roadblocks. Definitely the paradigm, but definitely this institutional agricultural mindset that people have, that this land is only for cattle and livestock, and that predators should be eliminated, and we should keep the status quo. And our leadership at the tribal level, at the state and federal level are roadblocks. You know, everything you mentioned are all extremely difficult things to get through.
Jason, if I could sort of actually add to, or sort of pile on to Amy's question, if you were talking to a new, Secretary of Interior, given that they have so much influence over many areas here, would there be one or a few things that you would say if you had limited space right now? Is there one or two levers that you would want to see pulled that would either increase the tribal voice in decision making and governance, or anything else?
I would tell them to uphold sovereignty and fulfill trust responsibility and ensure that tribes have access to food sovereignty.
Robin, I see your hand there.
Yes. Hello, Jason. My name's Robin Lopez. I'm a third-year PhD student. One of my advisors, Ted Grantham, he just left us. So my work, I focused on the intersection of soils, waters, climate, and environmental justice. I've had background with the U.S. Department of Energy since 2012, working on Arctic ecosystem, analyzing soils. And part of the reason I had pursued a PhD was because I wanted to have autonomy over what I do and how I do it. I felt very, very confined with and being in that space. And so what you just spoke to a couple questions back about being careful about how these institutions try to pivot us and try to force people of color, people of very complex and nuanced identities to adopt this very westernized, colonized thinking that really spoke to me. And the interconnectedness of that too, being that sometimes we are rendered as not being as knowledgeable as we really are. And so bring that all together. When I watched the short film Wind River, I was very offended when an individual, I believe his name was Bill Brown, had stated that tribal folks are speaking and don't know anything about hydraulic regime. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, because that's something that many Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in academia are constantly dealt with. We have the expertise, we have the research, we have the credentials, and we're still invalidated with what we do and how we do it.
I think, thank you for that, Robin. In some institutions, we're working hard to, I still teach a course at MSU about the holistic process and incorporating, we call it traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge, and helping that in a holistic way formulate students' ideas around a topic or a contemporary challenge of indigenous communities. And this course was the only one in entire MSU curriculum that required students to go to a reservation, because what that creates is cognitive dissonance. And with that cognitive dissonance, we can really help other people of the dominant culture understand a little bit more about where we come from. My father is a retired biologist, but he was forced to retire early by the Secretary of Interior for his advocacy on behalf of fish and the tribes and opposition of the state of Wyoming. So the Secretary of Interior forced him to retire early, and he lost a good deal of his pension for it. His advice to me was, don't work for the federal government, don't work for the state government and don't work for tribal government, because you're going to be limited in things that you can say and do. You said instead, be able to work for what you're passionate and what you believe in. And that's left me with the nonprofit sector, academia, and entrepreneurship. And so I'm in, and I focus on those realms because in my position with the nonprofit National Wildlife Federation, I can speak and say and do those things that I'm passionate about in terms of buffalo and also about water. Whereas in one of those federal or state or tribal positions, I would really be limited in what I could say and do. Academia, we really have the opportunity to expose and engage students in a different way of knowing, other ways of knowing and thinking, and implement that into the work that we do or the things that we study and research. And so, I guess I have yet to take on entrepreneurship, but so far so good. I think that in that, I'm really working on developing a Buffalo Institute where we can provide educational opportunities for our school kids from a completely cultural perspective. We can decolonize our way of knowing and learning by creating educational programs that are based in who we are, as opposed to the dominant or the societal way of doing things. And so for me, I think that's how we do it. Decolonize our teaching, decolonize our way of knowing, and reinvigorate those morals and values that our grandmas and grandpas held, which were essentially removed from us. So, I encourage you to keep your roots very deep. Hold strong to those, and ensure that what you're doing is beneficial and it's something that you're passionate about, so that not only does the university benefit from your research, but you personally take something away from it that's important to you.
Well, anybody else want to ask Jason a question? Thomas.
Hi, yeah. Also doing the real hand because I couldn't figure out the virtual one. But yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. Found it really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot. I'm a postdoc in the wildlife labs here, Justin's postdoc, and I'm working on a project led by the Karuk tribe in Northern California, specifically looking at their elk populations up there. And it's been my understanding that the goal of our project is to basically move towards a co-management of elk between the Karuk tribe and the state of California on their ancestral lands. And I think I'm coming from a place of ignorance, but it's, to me, seemed to be very challenging, especially because the Karuk don't have a reservation. They're federally recognized, but there's really that checkerboard pattern going on where there's just very small amounts of tribal lands, owned lands in their ancestral territory. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you guys have gone towards co-management, and if there's ways to adapt without having a reservation, or if you found the reservation to be a detriment, or if that's helped in going forward.
Yeah, the Wind River Reservation was originally the Shoshone Reservation, and in 1863 it was 44 million acres. Because of the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe, and the Mormon Trail that converts through our territory, only 5 years later in the Treaty of 1868, it was reduced by 42 million acres. This is a similar story, of course, that happened with all tribes in that land reduction. But we have to remember that federal Indian law has language in it that it wasn't the federal government giving tribes land. It was the tribes reserving lands in exchange for other lands to the federal government. So reservations were created as islands for our people to maintain our language and culture and customs. Of course, that didn't happen because all those treaties were violated. But the language is there that allows tribes to exercise sovereignty in our traditional territories. And federal law, even this year, has been backing up that. So for instance, Oklahoma, in the case that was decided that eastern half of Oklahoma is Indian country. The Herrera case in Wyoming that asserts that off-reservation hunting was not diminished with statehood. These court cases are setting some precedent in recognition of those treaty rights reserved by tribes. It's just that a lot of those things have been chipped away at unlawfully without those tribes really challenging that. And so in each reservation and each community, it's a different set of circumstances, but the legal aspects of asserting sovereignty and our rights to our traditional territories is kind of unexplored territory yet in the legal realm. How we exercise those rights to lands that were historically reservation, we have yet to see how some of those things are going to play out. A lot of tribes that have very little land base, it's going to be extremely difficult for those tribes to get some of that access back. We are considered a large land-based tribe here because our reservation is essentially the same size. And so we have a much larger opportunities in exercising those rights without any argument from say non-Indian users or cattle grazers or that sort of thing. Even some of our adjacent lands are national forest and national park and wilderness areas, asserting our sovereignty to those historic areas for hunting and harvesting of plants and trees is something that we can do. We can explore that, and we have exercised that right because really the state, by federal law, cannot really intervene in that. They're going to try, and they sure as hell try to limit a lot of things that tribes can do. But if we take it to court, tribes will win. And so, we've got to be kind of careful and strategic about how we go about exercising those rights within our governments and within our territories and within our states. There's lobbying that we can do. Maybe there's some relationships that we can establish with legislators. Maybe there's some drafts, some language that we can draft in bills that will be beneficial and recognized by the state. So I think a lot of these partnerships and collaborations open up the door really to exploring where we can go. And, that varies a lot. And it's difficult, but, it's familiarizing yourself with the challenges and the circumstances and the history for those tribes in which we're located and that history with the local, state, and federal government.
Jason, I think a number of people here watched the Wind River film that you shared, and so I guess I would call attention to and thinking about the tricky and difficult legal uphill battle to ensure that even when these rights are clearly worded and understood, still this uphill battle seems represented by that awful mean chuckle of Justice Thomas of the Wyoming Supreme Court when he's expressing his view that after all the Indians lost, and it's just stunning. And think you really have helped me understand that when you can't even trust the legal system, you can't trust the courts, then you have a much longer and more complicated battle, because now you even have to pick when and in what court and to whom you try and articulate these rights, for fear you'll end up with a precedent that actually sets you back and doesn't, expand those rights back to where they ought to be. So anybody who hasn't watched that should go watch it to have a sense of how difficult the struggle is. I was hoping while I was rambling, someone would raise their hand, but I'm not seeing that. And Jason, we want to recognize that it's now 6:20 your time, and it's time for you to probably join your loved ones and be finished with all of us, unless anybody has a kind of burning question that wants to have the last word.
And Arthur, I'm available too by email or phone if anybody would be interested in further discussion, and might be able to provide some further resources if students were interested. So feel free to reach out and engage in that way if other questions arise.
Okay. Well, Jason, thank you so much for that generous offer. And I, for one, sure look forward to seeing you next time I'm in Wyoming. Maybe we can, maybe others in our group will be able to do the same. We actually have quite a few students who spend quite a bit of time out in Cody and Jackson. So
yeah, most definitely. We should prioritize that. That'd be important for me as well as you guys to be able to share and help, see some of this on the ground stuff. We could go to Diversion Dam. We could go see the buffalo. We can see what happens to the river. It's all within about 30 minutes of me right here. So no, keep that offer stands and is open. So look forward to that.
well, thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining and bringing your questions. And Jason, we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thanks everybody. Appreciate all the involvement and your enthusiasm, and keep up the good work there in California, and stay safe. Man, we can see the smoke here in Wyoming, and best to you guys out there. And till next time. We have no goodbyes in our language, so it's just till next time.
Okay. Till next time.
Thanks for everything, Arthur.
See you guys.